As the Blackstone Canal Company began its downward spiral, a new mode of transportation was clearly on the rise, the railroad. In 1848, the Providence and Worcester Railroad built a section of tracks down along the Blackstone River and along the east side of Quinsigamond Village that would connect the two great cities of New England, Providence and Worcester. The P&W Railroad would also build a rail spur into the Washburn and Moen rolling mill in Quinsigamond. Barbed wire, telegraph wire, crinoline wire for the fashionable hoop skirts, and later springs for the expanding agricultural machinery industry, all were part of Washburn and Moen's wire empire. And central to all this growth were the use of Swedish iron bars in the Washburn and Moen's mills. Hi, I'm Chuck Arning, National Park Service Ranger here in the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And the tall weeds, the boarded up windows, and the rusty railroad tracks belie the real significance of this area. But this was the site of Washburn and Moen's giant Southworks, part of their huge wire industry here. Historians will tell you that America's wire industry was born right here in Worcester, Massachusetts. And such an expanding industry required workers, knowledgeable, industrious, hard-working, thrifty, and sober workers. And the industrial and urban centers of Sweden provided just such a worker. By 1910, the city of Worcester had the largest Scandinavian population of any city in America in relation to its size. So join me as we explore the Swedish influence here in the Blackstone Valley. From Worcester to East Providence, the Swedes played a key role in the industrial successes and the ethnic tensions of the Blackstone Valley.
Proud of being a Swede, and because well, I've been brought up that way, and my dad used to be so proud of being a Swede, and I wish the only thing I wish that they had done was to speak Swedish to me so I could have learned the Swedish language. I learned it more by association as I grew older.
He wanted to speak perfect English. Not only that, he wanted us to speak English. He didn't want us to speak Swedish. So there wasn't very much Swedish spoken around the house, especially when they got down to the youngest person, who was me. None of us spoke Swedish. He didn't want us to speak Swedish. He wanted us to be an American, through and through. And I think that's probably the reason why my grandfather made that donation to the Lincoln Historical Society. He wanted to be considered an American, not a Swede.
Early on, it almost appeared as if everybody did have a Swedish name. So all of the people that were hired by Norton, for the most part, had to have had some Swedish derivation. And then as a result of them being employed, their relatives, friends, that they would recommend who were Swedish would automatically be hired also, had they met the qualifications. But it was predominantly Swedish for many, many years. Maybe that's one of the reasons it was a great company.
Standing here in the center, in the heart of Quinsigamond Village, right by its newly renovated school. And you can tell from the vast size of the school, as well as their ability to capture some of the historical accuracy of the architecture, that education is very important to the people of Quinsigamond Village. Matter of fact, if you were a Swedish immigrant to this country, one of the most important documents you would bring with you were your report cards. Proof of a good education, hard working with good attendance, was very important to any prospective employer. Now, why did the Swedes come to Worcester? Why didn't they go to the upper Midwest like so many of their other countrymen did? And why was the Swedish immigrant experience here so vastly different than other immigrants, such as the Irish and French Canadians and the Italians? Why were the Swedes treated differently? We'll answer those questions. We're going to catch up with our good friends, Dr. Charles Estes and Dr. John McClymer of Assumption College, authors of the book Go Till America, who are sitting right behind us at the First Swedish Methodist Church. It's going to be a lively discussion, folks. This should be good. Come on. What brought the Swedes to Quinsigamond and Worcester in the first place, and why did they stay?
Well, this village was first settled by Swedes who had grown up with and learned the iron culture of Värmland, Sweden, in south-central Sweden. They had come from a community called Degerfors in Värmland, southern Värmland, where they had all been members of an organizing group forming the First Methodist Church there in Sweden. Members of that church then immigrated to the United States and to the Upper Peninsula in Michigan, where the first iron ranges were opened up in the United States, and worked those ranges. And then, we're not sure how, but discovered the developing iron and steel industry here in Worcester. And in 1875, 5 or 6 families, not individuals, but families, migrated from the Upper Peninsula in Michigan to Quinsigamond Village and opened the floodgates to hundreds and hundreds then who followed them in the decades that followed.
It turns out, if you look at migration patterns, that people from the same part of one country, we're talking village here as well as larger areas, but down to the village level, will all go, or many of them will go to the exact same place in the U.S. They'll go to the same neighborhood in Cleveland. So people in Degerfors will come to Quinsigamond Village in Worcester, and that's quite common as the way migration works. But how those chains first form is what's hard to figure out, and we really wanted to be able to find that piece of paper somewhere which would say there was somebody from Worcester who was interested in recruiting Swedes and get them to work in the wire industry here, because they were so happy to see, the employers were so happy to see the Swedes when they showed up, but there was no such connection. So
they came from an iron culture in Sweden, so they were skilled. Many grew up as little boys learning to sort ore, learning to work as young apprentices in the smelters.
The steel workers, most of them came from the province of Värmland, and they used water power for their toys there at a small stream. And of course the hammers and the mills were, as well, all the equipment was run by water power. But my grandfather made 3 of these, and we're going to repair it. But maybe Carl, you can turn the crank. I can hold it here. This lifted the crank up. So we've got to make a piece to go on here, and then there was another piece that came over the top to keep the hammer from flying up too high. So it was a replica of the old hammers in the old mills. And of course, another thing about the Swedish people in Worcester, most of them that came here were tradesmen. They were not farmers. They had, many of them were die makers, and they had other trades in the steel industry.
When you asked earlier, Chuck, about why they were so welcomed here, they're also literate. They came as a literate industrial labor force. People who had grown up in that folk school tradition where not simply the elite were educated, but now the common person was educated in these folk schools with rudimentary education. And as part of some of the things they brought with them were their school records, like their diplomas and what we would call report cards, were a very important part of the equipment that you brought to show your Yankee employer that you were a very important kind of person to work in the industries of the city.
I was sent over to the rod mill. Man, that was really something, you know, to see these big billets go into a furnace and then be drawn into rods. And there was a man standing with a pair of tongs, and this hot rod would come out, and he'd have to swing it around his head like that and put it into a die. And each pass made it smaller. And then when it came out and it was coiled, came out on a carrier. And my job was to stand alongside these. Now, they weren't red hot now, but they were hot, and put wire ties on them as they went along.
This was a time when there was a great deal of ethnic and cultural religious tension, not just in Worcester, but across the country. And the previous large migration groups to come in were Irish and French Canadian, were very Catholic groups, both of them. And there was a good deal of tension over the public schools, over, Charles was referring to temperance, in Worcester, this took the form every year of a vote on whether or not saloons would be licensed. So every year, Worcester's citizens got the chance to vote themselves wet or dry. On only 4 occasions did they vote dry, but some of the elections were very close, and it kept the politics roiling throughout. And so when the Swedes show up, they fit into this cultural alignment in a particular place, and they know where they fit, and the Yankees know where they fit, and it's on the opposite side from the Irish and the French Canadians.
Our colleague in this enterprise, Professor Kenneth Moynihan, calls it a partnership between the Protestant Swedes and the Yankee leadership. And that's why, Chuck, we called our book Go Till America, which means a stroll, not a journey, not an arduous trip, not a wrenching experience, but simply a stroll to America, as if you were going downtown to look for a job. They felt themselves so welcome, so much a part of the industrial developing Worcester that they simply strolled to America. They didn't journey or travel, but took a walk.
Saturday night, what was it like in Quinsigamond Village?
It was very lively. I mean, despite what we've been saying about the absence of saloons and no place where you could buy tobacco, but there were endless dances. There were endless music recitals. There were just I mean, in a church like this, we tend to think of churches as existing strictly for religious purposes, and of course that's the central mission, but they also organize just endless activities. And so in some ways, when you talk about a church being a social center, you have this notion that everyone comes and prays, and everyone does come, and they do pray, and they're very serious about that, but they also dance, or they play musical instruments, or they give concerts, or they put on plays, or they organize athletic teams. So there's a great deal that's going on.
They played various bands that would dig up to play at dances. And we also had a church basketball league. And there were different activities of that type that we had for entertainment.
I started singing right after I got confirmed. I joined the junior choir because ever since I was a little girl, I guess because I loved the singing so much, even when we were in Sunday school.
At the age of 18, I went into the wire mill to work, American Steel and Wire, which every kid in Quincy seemed to do at that time. And amongst the workers in there were 2 brothers by the name of Momberg. And the village of Quincy had no, with the one exception, had no liquor. Stagg and I were walking home from work one day, and he says, "See that empty store over there?" He says, "I'm going up and apply to have a beer permit to sell beer in that." And I looked at it and I said, "Stagg, when I go to church on Sunday morning, every church in the village, and there were about 5 or 6 of them, will have some kind of a petition in there to be signed." And sure enough, Sunday morning there was a petition against against the beer parlor, and it never did go through.
It came to singing for the Crown Prince. We belonged to what we call Fromort Club, which is a children's club, and it was part of the Voss Order of America. And at that time, it was, we had, well, I would say around 40 children that attended those meetings, or it was learning Swedish and learning the songs and the dances and everything. So we had to go to Cambridge to compete to see who would be chosen to sing for the Crown Prince. And I happened to be singing in this trio at the time. So we had our pianist that used to play for us. She composed A Cœur d'Unga Dora and Norrlänningens Hemlängtan, which are two Swedish songs that we learned in trio. And we competed with those two songs, and we happened to be chosen one of two acts that were going to go to sing for the Crown Prince.
Coming home from school, it was in Anderson and Sundquist Market. And you wouldn't remember, but in those days they had sawdust on the floor. And they used to sweep that up every once in a while, of course. But the cookies came in boxes about that square. And they had a kind of a celluloid cover that they could lift up. They had them in a rack. And if you wanted a pound of cookies, they would open this cover up and put their hand in and put them in a bag. Nothing was packaged in those days. And occasionally one would fall, in the sawdust. And we would run home from school and try to get an Anderson Sundquist first, and pick up any cookie that had fallen in the sawdust. Yeah.
But certainly there was music and singing in all the congregations on Saturday night. But you're right, no barroom brawls, no loose living on the streets, not at all.
Unlike many ethnic groups, the American dream really worked for the Swedes.
Embarrassingly so, as we tell our students.
Yeah.
It did. It really worked.
And
socially, politically, economically.
Because,
well.
as your question implies, there was always a pecking order among ethnic groups, people standing in line, and first in line were the Yankees, and they got first dibs on whatever was out there. And standing second on line in Worcester were Swedes, and they got to pick what was still there. And depending on where you were in line, and every ethnic group knew this, there was only so much going to be left for you. And if some group like the Swedes came in after you and moved ahead of you in the line, that engendered a considerable amount of bitterness. The only thing that made the line tolerable for most ethnic groups was the sense that some group would come in after you, would be even further down the line, and you would be pushed up just because there was now someone else below you. But for a group to cut in, as the Swedes did, engendered a good deal of tension, as you can imagine.
One of the industries here that developed out of the wire industries, that are making screws and that sort of thing, we're told that this lad's grandfather, or great-grandfather, I can't remember, would literally go down the line of workers lined up seeking employment and look for Swedes in that line and would pick them out of the line. That is, in front of the Irish or in front of any other immigrant worker waiting for work. Quite literally, it was a visible preference expressed for the Swedish worker.
Yeah. Of course, I grew up with the idea of Norton. Everybody I knew, all the adults at any rate, worked here. My father worked here. And I had decided at one point that I was going to see about getting a job here at Norton also. This was in 1950. I went to the employment office after having talked to my father that I was going to go over there. But in the meantime, what he had done was he had talked to his superintendent to say that another potential Norton person was coming to the employment office. When I came into the employment office at that time, there were probably 50 people waiting to be hired. Well, as it turned out, my father's superintendent came in with the employment manager. I did have an acquaintance with both of them. The employment manager made a loud announcement, "We are not hiring today, except for him." That's how I started working at Norton.
If you were to look back on a Swedish presence here, what influence did the Swedes have?
When we first got into trying to understand Worcester generally, one of the striking features was that there was no viable union movement in the city, though it was the largest industrial center in New England. No unions until after the Second World War. That's very strange. Secondly, that here was an industrial city full of immigrant populations in the labor force, dominated mostly by the Republican Party. Now, you do not find that in industrial centers that make great use of immigrant labor. The Democratic Party usually is certainly viable, if not more successful. And that was a puzzle to us until we found the Swedes. That important block of human beings, Protestant, publicly temperate, hard workers, disciplined Republicans, were the swing population in many major issues within the city. And so I would say, in many ways, their real impact is to make Worcester a very unique, very fascinating industrial center in American history.
It does make Worcester a very interesting and unique place. Part of what's interesting about the Swedes, a lot of that lasting impact is invisible because of their tendency to see themselves as fitting so cleanly and completely into that English-speaking world.
Yeah, but the subtext continues to be very strong Swedish influence. And so it was a stroll to America.
Now, the city of Worcester doesn't have a corner in the market as far as Swedish heritage goes. All you have to do is travel further down the river to East Providence to learn about a whole new and very different Swedish community. Now, the story relates to freshness, baking powder, and a Rumford Chemical Company. So let's join our good friends at the East Providence Historical Society, and maybe, if we play our cards right, we'll get a chance to sample some really good Swedish bread. Come on. We're here at the Handy Bake Shop in the village of Rumford in East Providence with Edna Annis. And Edna is the curator for the John Hunt Historical House and Museum. But we're talking about the Swedes, and the Swedes had an influence here in East Providence as well as Worcester, didn't they, Edna?
Right.
Why did they come to East Providence? What was the draw?
Well, one of the draws was the Rumford Chemical Works sent recruits from the company to the Boston port of entry and encouraged the Swedes to come down here to work at the Rumford Chemical Works. The first ones arrived in 1871.
No kidding, and they actually sent agents out there to recruit workers.
Because they knew they were hardworking and industrious.
No kidding. Now we're here in the what has become almost known as a Swedish bakery, the Handy Bake Shop. What's the connection between Rumford Chemical and the Swedish bakers?
Well, the Rumford Chemical Works exported baking powder all over the world, as far south as Australia and throughout Europe. And the bakers quickly in Sweden became aware of the rising capabilities of the baking powder. They had one problem, however. It was damp up there. And between bakings, if they didn't use the whole can of baking powder, when they went back to use it the second time, the raising elements would have been altered. And so they persuaded the Rumford Company to export their cans in these small 1-ounce sizes. And they came in these boxes, 8 dozen to a box, and you can see they're printed in Swedish, and the box is printed. This way, the baker could do his weekly baking and throw the can away when he finished it, or if he only had a little left, he would throw it away and he wouldn't be wasting a lot of money. And then he would open the next new, smaller can when he baked the next time. So baking powder was very well known in Sweden. And that, too, could have been one of the reasons why people heard about the Rumford Baking Powder Company. Also, there were people in the area, such as Ellen Jensel, who lived across the street here, who went back to Sibol, Sweden, and recruited men to come here to work at the Rumford. And she had a twofold interest. She ran a boarding house. And so the men who came into this area boarded with her, and as more and more came, her house got larger and larger.
No kidding.
He came to this country in 1901. Well, when he came over, he had already made arrangements to have some sort of a job someplace to stay with a person by the name of Mrs. Jensel. Now, you've heard this name before. Mrs. Jensel was the mother-in-law of Gilbert Helgeson, who ran the handy shop. And apparently she took in boarders from Sweden. They stayed in the cellar. She provided them with food and comfort while they became acquainted in the area.
This bakery that we're standing in is owned by Claude and Donna Duckworth, and Donna is of Swedish ancestry. And although this bakery did not open as a Swedish bakery, they used her recipes from her grandmother and her mother. And very shortly after it opened, it became known locally as the Swedish bakery because of the excellent breads that were made here. After 1882, when the Rumford Chemical Works had platted this area of Rumford for single-family mill housing, that they needed a store local to the area that the workers' families could walk to instead of walking across town to the Rumford market. And so this building next door was built as the Pioneer Food Store by Mrs. Jensel. And in 1925, Adolf, who married her daughter, and also was a carpenter, had nothing to do with the Rumford Chemical Works, built where we're standing as a three-store building. Only after he got it finished, he decided, you know, we need a local handy shop. And he sold housewares and hardwares and clothing and towels and all that sort of thing, except, to quote him, the three evil items: liquor, cigarettes, and filthy books.
He was determined that he was not going to speak English with an accent. And he did. He spoke perfect English, impeccable English. He would occasionally mispronounce a word like yellow. You know, if he got angry, he'd say jello. Or he was a machine shop foreman. He would say, he might say, that damn union, they're trying to organize this factory, you know. But most of the Swedes had a profound accent, although they spoke excellent English.
On one hand, from the language standpoint, you wanted to fit in, and so you did not, if I was to hear your dad speak, I would not know that he was Swedish. On the other hand, very strong supporter of the Swedish community.
No question. There's a lot of duplicity. A lot of duplicity.
Do you think that duplicity, and I find this again fascinating, was more a result of how hard it was to be an immigrant to the United States? And so I want to fit in so I don't get singled out?
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, that was a large part of it. He didn't want to be discriminated against. I guess maybe he didn't mind being discriminated for, and probably utilized the fact that he could speak Swedish with those Swedes who were, you know, on a higher level than him, or than he. I think that's true.
Well, this has been National Park Service Ranger Chuck Arning here in the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor. And the most fascinating aspect of the Swedish experience here in the Blackstone Valley is just how different it is from the other immigrant groups. It's not the same as the French Canadians, or the Irish, or the Cape Verdeans, or from other immigrant groups. They came here with a specific goal in mind and chose a path that they believe would get them to their dream of a future here for themselves and for their families. And I guess what it tells us is that being an immigrant to the United States is not an easy path. We all came from somewhere, and just perhaps we might make it easier on those newcomers as they try to make their way into American society. So until next time, hope to see you in the Valley.